Let's start with some basic terminology. A lot of people think of the Bible as being exclusively a Christian book. They think that Christians have the Bible, Muslims have the Quran, and Jews have the Torah. But this is not quite correct. You see, Jews also have a Bible. We call it the Tanakh, but it is also simply known as the Jewish Bible. As you probably know, Christians divide their Bible into the Old Testament and New Testament. Well, what Christians call the Old Testament is actually the exact same book as what we Jews simply know as the Jewish Bible, or the Tanakh. What about the Torah then? Well, Christians call the first 5 books of the Old Testament the Pentateuch, meaning the 5 scrolls. These are Genesis through Deuteronomy. For Jews, these same 5 books are called the Torah. So the Torah is simply the name for the first 5 books of the Tanakh, which happen to be the exact same 5 books as the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. So it doesn't matter if you pick up a Jewish Bible or a Christian Bible. Other than some minor translation differences, the first 5 books are going to be exactly the same. Now, there's a third Jewish book you might have heard of that also starts with a T. That's the Talmud. But the Talmud is not actually considered part of the Jewish Bible. It's an entirely different book comprised of oral traditions and commentary on those traditions written by rabbis. What we're going to be concerned with in this episode is just the Torah, or Pentateuch, aka Genesis through Deuteronomy. So let's dive in. From a traditional point of view, the answer to the question, who wrote this part of the Bible, is easy. It was Moses. And for some Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians, there is simply no questioning that. But for the majority of Jews today, like myself, as well as most Christians, the answer is not so simple. As I mentioned in my video on Did Moses Exist? From a historian's point of view, Moses is more of a legendary character, and the stories about him quite clearly include many literary elements. It's also very obvious to language experts who study the Torah that it is definitely not the work of a single author. Rather, it clearly consists of many layers that were pieced together over time. Now, this actually makes a lot of sense, considering that the Torah deals with events that were initially passed down orally. Whenever this happens, you usually wind up with multiple versions of the same story, and this is exactly what you find in the Torah. For example, there are 2 separate creation accounts, 2 separate stories of Abraham lying about his wife Sarah, 2 accounts of God changing Jacob's name to Israel, and so on. According to some tallies, there are about 30 examples of these kind of doublets in the Torah. So what almost every scholar agrees on within the field of Pentateuch studies is that there were definitely several distinct authors involved. But what they do not agree on is exactly who those authors were and in which order they contributed their material. Because of this, I cannot present you with one definitive answer to who wrote the Torah and when. Therefore, I'm going to present you with 3 different theories and let you make the final decision. The first theory is the one that you're most likely to have heard of if you're at all familiar with any of this. It's called the documentary hypothesis, and it's been around since the 1800s. Nowadays, there are many variations of it, but the basic idea is that the Torah was pieced together from 4 different original sources. These have been labeled the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources, or more commonly, J, E, D, and P. Note that I'll be using these 4 letters extensively throughout the rest of the video. So, according to the documentary hypothesis, Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers are all a mix of J, E, and P. Leviticus is entirely P, And, as you might have guessed, Deuteronomy is entirely D. Note that the black areas of the chart represent other texts that do not fall into the main four. The original theory was that J was written during the reign of Solomon, when the Israelites were supposedly united and at the height of their power. E was written by someone in the breakaway northern kingdom of Israel. D was written during the reign of Josiah, after the fall of the northern kingdom, and P was written after the Jews returned from Babylon. Now, like I said, there are many different variations of this theory. For example, nowadays, J and E are often combined into a single source. P is sometimes placed before the exile, and D is usually divided into two or more stages. But the basic theory remains the same. Multiple sources combined together to create the Torah, sometime during the Second Temple period. However, the main problem with this theory is the overall timing. The latest research from archaeology indicates that the Bible greatly exaggerates its description of Solomon's reign. In fact, many scholars today believe that there likely never was a unified kingdom, and that the Israelites were probably not strict monotheists until the reign of King Josiah. Which brings me to the second theory, the supplementary hypothesis. The supplementary hypothesis is kind of an updated or modified version of the documentary hypothesis. It's probably the most popular view nowadays, although keep in mind that there are also several different versions of it. According to this theory, Deuteronomy, or D, was the original version of the Torah, and it was indeed written around the time of King Josiah. Some scholars believe that this is when monotheism really started to be promoted in a big way for the first time. The reason being that it was a way to unify the newcomers from the north with the original inhabitants from the south. But in a major change from the original theory, J and E are no longer seen as separate sources, but rather as supplementary material that was added alongside D during the Babylonian exile. And P is seen as an additional set of supplementary material added by priests during the Second Temple period. Finally, scholars now talk about a final author called R for redactor, who added just a few more things here and there before the Torah was finally complete. So rather than four separate sources, instead we get a single source with additional material being added to it over time. So that's basically where 21st century biblical scholarship currently stands on the matter. However, there is a new theory being explored nowadays, mostly in continental Europe. It came to my attention through a book called Genesis and the Moses Story, originally written in German by Konrad Schmid. I'm going to label this theory the dual origins theory. The main idea is that the ancient Israelites originally had two separate origin myths, one involving the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the other involving Moses and the Exodus story. According to this new theory, these two literary traditions developed independently from each other and remained separate until they were combined for the first time by the priestly writer. So D, which is obviously based on the Moses tradition, was written down first during the time of King Josiah. But at the same time as D, as well as both before and after D, there were other fragments of text floating around, some of which were based on the Moses tradition, but others of which were based on the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob tradition. Then, sometime during the Second Temple period, a group of priests living in Jerusalem decided, for the first time ever, to combine the two literary traditions into a single coherent narrative. They took bits from both the patriarchs' story and bits from the Moses story. These are the sections that were previously labeled J and E. And then they interwove them with their own text, the parts labeled P. Finally, someone at an even later stage, the redactor, or R, added a few final things, tacked Deuteronomy onto the end, and voila, the final version of the Torah was born. This third theory makes a lot of sense to me. It explains why the transition between Genesis and Exodus seems so abrupt, and why there are several chronological problems when it comes to dating how long the Israelites were in Egypt. In my view, everything prior to the divided monarchy falls into the category of myth and legend anyway, and therefore I see no problem with the idea of two separate sets of legends developing instead of just one. In fact, considering that the ancient Israelites were originally two separate kingdoms, it actually makes more sense that there would be two separate origin stories, not just one. So what biblical scholars are slowly starting to realize is that when it comes to the history of ancient Israel, we've basically had it backwards. Up until recently, the idea was that Israel was a united nation first and then a divided nation second, because that's what a literal reading of the Bible tells us. But as we continue to learn more from archaeology and literary analysis, we're discovering that the exact opposite was actually true. The Israelites were originally two separate nations, and then only later, after Assyria destroyed the north, did they become a truly unified people. Remember, after the north fell, many refugees from the kingdom of Israel headed south and joined the kingdom of Judah. So the unification happened not during the days of David and Solomon, but during the days of Hezekiah and Josiah, and then again after the Babylonian exile. Now, here's the part that I haven't heard anyone say yet. So keep in mind that this is pure conjecture at this point. In my opinion, I think it's more likely that the Moses tradition was the origin story developed in the northern kingdom, and the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob tradition was the origin story developed in the southern kingdom. For a long time now, scholars have associated D with Levite priests from the northern city of Shiloh, even though it was eventually compiled in the south in Jerusalem. As I mentioned in my video about Moses, the tribe of Levi has several interesting connections to Egypt and may have been the only tribe involved in some sort of historical exodus. Overall, it would appear that Moses was more of a northern hero, and Aaron was adopted as more of a southern hero. The southern priests were actually a bit negative toward Levites in general, and were known for believing that only their particular lineage, which they traced to Aaron, was truly legitimate. Joseph, the other main character associated with Egypt, was also more of a northern hero. He was supposedly the progenitor of the two largest northern tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. In contrast, in the south, Judah was portrayed as being the most important son of Jacob. In fact, it's possible that Joseph was originally not thought of as a son of Jacob at all. Note that Jacob has two names, Jacob and Israel. Maybe these were originally two separate people. Maybe Jacob was the father of Judah and Israel was the father of Joseph. Maybe it was only later that Jacob and Israel were merged into a single character. So interestingly, the north has more associations with Egypt, and the south has more associations with Mesopotamia. Remember, Mesopotamia is where Abraham was said to originate from. And it is the book of Genesis that incorporates mythology that is very reminiscent of Mesopotamian mythology, the flood story being a good example. Perhaps this material was picked up during the Babylonian exile. So, as is often the case, history is strongly influenced by geography. Because the Israelites were for so many centuries nestled between two major powers, Egypt on one side and Assyria-Babylon on the other, it's not surprising that they developed a culture that fused elements from both these powers and their various interactions with them. Anyway, like I said, this third theory is yet to be fully fleshed out. The second theory is the one that's currently the more mainstream explanation. But I think the dual origins theory is very promising, and therefore I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think it is likely to be the dominant theory in the future. Okay, so that was a look at who wrote the Torah. Let me know in the comments what your opinion is on the topic. And stay tuned for the next episode in the series. Episode 2 will focus on the prophets, the next major section of the Jewish Bible, aka the Old Testament. Thanks for watching.